Inshallah. All right, so I want to begin, of course, in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Bismillah. Welcome back, everybody. We are continuing, inshallah, with our Aqeedah series. Can I hear a few voices of recap of something that we covered last week? Anything at all, even if you give me just one sentence. We did this, or we talked about that. And please, just before you talk, say your name, because I'm still trying to memorize. I got some names, but it's going to take a lot of repetition. Something we covered last week. Yalla, the quicker you answer, the quicker we move on. Yes. Jazakallah khairan. That was based on the question that Ahmed had sent, right? Which is finding the balance between a spiritual and logical approach to our faith. What is the proper balance? The short answer is, well, look to the Quran. The Quran is going to give you the proper balance. The longer answer is that the Quran, Allah addresses us primarily in 4 different arguments, or 4 categories of arguments. What are those categories? You can call them out. Emotional, yes. Logical, social, and spiritual. Yes, those are our 4. Social, emotional, logical, and spiritual. They're not in any particular order, and depending on where you are at in your life, what your circumstances are, depending on the surah. If it's different surahs are targeting different things. The Madani surahs have a lot more logical and social, right? There's a lot more rules. There's a lot more appeal to logic. Whereas the initial surahs, where the Mekki surahs that were short and emotional and spiritual primarily, right? Talking about akhirah, talking about وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ وَإِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ, right? Talking about how the life will be on the Day of Judgment and so on. May Allah protect us. So depending on so many factors, the balance changes. But yeah, ultimately, you in your journey with yourself, but in your journey with others, you're going to have to rebalance as needed. And if one tool is, or one category is not working, maybe you need to switch up. Okay, let's hear 2 more voices about something we covered last week. We talked about 2 authors. Who were they? Oh, it was here on your phone? At-Tahawi, who is the author that we're spending basically the whole time with. He is we're reading his treatise, Al-Aqeedah At-Tahawiyya. It's referred to as that. His treatise on Aqeedah. It's very short, and basically he wrote in point format, which is very convenient for us. How what are the beliefs Ahl Sunnah should have, or a Muslim in general should have, I should say. And he wrote this about 1100 years ago, which is a long time ago. Shortly after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, like only a few hundred years, not too many generations. So he's closer to the time of the Prophet ﷺ than he is to us, yeah, right? By hundreds of years. Yet you will see, obviously the belief system has not changed, alhamdulillah, it is what we believe in as well. And we will come with glimpses here and there of what he and his era were dealing with. What are the struggles of Aqeedah they were dealing with, challenges of Aqeedah and so on. Who is the other author? An-Nawawi, right? We're not going to be spending so much time with him. He was about 400 years after At-Tahawi, which is right down the middle, right down the center between us and the Prophet ﷺ. So he was about in the year in the what is it, 8th century Hijri, or 700 something, and we are 1400 something, right? And the Prophet ﷺ was at year 1 Hijri. So talking about right down the middle between us and the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so we got to know them a little bit. We started going through At-Tahawi's treatise, right? Okay, so before we get started today, I just want to mention a brief. There's a reason why I gave the intro to both of these authors, even though it might not come up again throughout our conversation. Here's a pro tip when you're reading Islamic works. There's thousands of books. A lot of them are famous. They have rose to the top, and they're going to be the ones that somebody recommends to you, that they get translated, that you come across. Those are the ones that often you're going to busy yourself with. So whether you're a researcher, you find the more obscure books, or whether you just deal with the books that are popular and so on, the same tip applies. 3 things you should ask yourself, or try to find out a little bit as you begin the book. Usually, especially if it's translated, it's going to be in the preface, in the introduction, the translator's commentary, the author's or the publisher's note. It's all going to be there, so it's just easily done for you. In fact, in At-Tahawi's book, there's like a 5-10 page bio on his whole life to begin with. Even the English, several of the English translations, you find the same thing. So these are the questions you want to ask yourself. Well, learn a little bit about the author. Like, where is the author from? We said that Tahawi was from Egypt 1100 years ago, and Nawawi was in Syria, Damascus 700 years ago. So the idea is you get to pinpoint the region where they came from in Islamic history, and if you know a little bit about the history of that region, which is number 2, when was this book written? Different writing styles and different challenges occurred throughout Islamic history. It's a big deal. How many of you are familiar with Tafsir Ibn Kathir? Pretty much the most famous tafsir of the Quran, right? Ibn Kathir was a scholar. I'm really bad with dates and so on, but in his era, his tafsir is not an easy read. It's not meant to be read like a book. It's more encyclopedia format. It's more of a compilation of tons of narrations. Some of them are hadith, some of them are Isra'iliyat, meaning narrations that come from before our time as Muslims, and they are attributed to the Jews and the Christians, their scriptures, or just stories he heard along the way. He traveled a lot. So he never wrote it with the intention of it being a book that's read like and some of the narrations there, a lot of them are da'if, they're not authentic, others are authentic. He never intended it as an authentic compilation. You got to understand the author's intent. You got to understand a little bit about the writing style of the time. What was the goal of the time? To compile as much text as we can about this topic. And then somebody else's job would be to decipher it. Somebody else's job would be to turn it into a readable format that reads like, something for tafsir. Like this generation, there's a lot more in our past 50 years or so. There's Aysar al-Tafsir, al-Tafsir al-Muyassar. There's like three different versions of different authors who wrote like a Tafsir al-Muyassar, meaning the easy to understand, easy to read, easy to digest tafsir. They break it pretty much. Their goal is to make the Quran as the tafsir itself, 1 line or 2 lines per ayah. Just a little bit of a tidbit about how to understand this ayah further. So when you understand the era, the challenges they faced, the goal of the author, it gives you a lot better rubric of how to deal with this book that you're dealing with now. At-Tahawi, his goal in Aqeedah was a concise, point-based sort of hit and run, sort of like, okay, there is none like God. Next. There's no partner besides God. Next. And others, most Aqeedah books, in fact, they're like paragraph format, and they're 100 pages, 200 pages and longer. And then you'll find, if you ever delve into the depths, every generation, or every 100, 200, 300 years, or whatever chunks they were, there's a new challenge in Aqeedah. We talked about last week, there's like the creation of the Quran. That was a big deal, because a lot of philosophical works were translated from other languages, like Greek, philosophy, and so on. So a lot of the philosophical arguments started to invade the Muslim world, whether just on purpose, intended by the enemy, or just simply happened to be because it's present now and it's available and it's accessible. So now a lot of people started asking questions they never asked before. How many of you have ever asked yourself, is the Quran created or not? It's not something that comes up, but now it's a challenge, and now there's a lot that is riding on it. Well, if this is if God can change, if God speaks, then therefore God can change, and if God can change, then it's a whole bunch of philosophical things that nobody bothers with unless it's a challenge of the time. So you might find some of the scholars you're familiar with, they wrote a whole book on it, and you're like, why should I? And some people say, well, it's a scholar I respect, so I should read the whole book. Not always, not necessarily. It's not a challenge you're dealing with. It's not something that's relevant in your time and era. Maybe not. Maybe you read something that's much more relevant, and so on and so forth. And the last question that you have to keep in mind is, what is the author's educational background? Particularly like in Islamic studies or whatever his background was. You find that it shows up in his work. A person whose background is fiqh, rulings and regulations, it's very dry, like myself. The approach is very methodical. It's very, we love to compartmentalize, we love to categorize. Whereas a person who's hadith, it's all about the authenticity, it's all about verifying, and they're much more strict with their stances, and so on and so forth. And it shows up in their work, and then you get to realize where they're coming from and what they focus on. So you ask yourself, where's the author from? When was this book written? What is the author's educational background? It gives you a little bit of a lens through which to read the book and to understand their challenges. When I say that challenges change in terms of Aqeedah, you might be like, well, Aqeedah stays the same. Why should the challenges of the time affect that? Well, like I told you now, the Aqeedah about the Quran, the example of the Quran being created, the belief didn't change. It's just that the belief is not being challenged, so we just gloss past it. So for example, in our day and age, if somebody were writing a Aqeedah book about, or not Aqeedah, if any, like a book about Islamic etiquette or Islamic understanding or whatever, maybe in 5 years from now or 10 years from now, they're going to write a book. They're going to be the rulings about the metaverse, virtual reality, right? Can you pray Jama'ah in the metaverse? And you're each at home? Yes or no? Did you guys, did this masjid do that during the COVID stuff? On Zoom? Some masajid did, right? And there was a big controversy. In New York, there was like a handful of masajid that did it. And a lot of people were like, how can you do that? So they prayed Jama'ah at home because everyone's stuck at home. And they said, well, you just pray behind the sheikh on Zoom. And it was a big thing. So now with the metaverse, it's going to add another layer because you're not just on Zoom watching a video. You see yourself, you look to the side and sheikh is right there. Now what? Do you think this problem is going to arise? It's dismissible right now. It's like, come on, how will that ever happen? That's like 5 years away, maybe less. So what about if somebody is somebody's male? They in the metaverse they put a female avatar. Can they go to the female section of the masjid in the metaverse? These things are going to come up. It's laughable right now. They're going to come up. Can you make Hajj virtually? Someone's taking you on it virtually. Obviously, it seems so clear cut. These answers are no now. Some of them won't be as clear cut very shortly. So these things might be so silly to somebody. If somebody, for example, puts in our belief system, well, there are only 2 genders. Somebody reading it 50 years ago, be like, what? Why do you even say that? Who cares? Like, it's a non-issue. Why would that be included in your book? But now it's the biggest issue, right? So things like that, where the focus or the challenges of the time become apparent through their writing. So you get to learn a lot more about the scholar, about what they were dealing with and why they put an emphasis. In At-Tahawiyya, you find out in his Aqeedah, he's talking about God and the presence of God. At the end, I don't know if we're going to reach the very end of the book. He says, wiping on socks or wiping on the leather, al-khuf. He mentions it in Aqeedah. You're like, wait a second. He's talking about Allah and there's none like him and God creates without needing to create and he causes others to die without fearing any consequence. And then you can wipe on your khuf. You're like, wait a second. But that was the Aqeedah challenge at the time. There was enough people challenging it, and it was directly from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said, no, this is a point where there's a lot more riding on this. If you reject this, then you reject hadith, or you reject the concept that rules can be derived from the Prophet ﷺ and other bigger concepts. So no, I'm going to hold my ground. This is Aqeedah. It is our belief that we can derive rulings directly from the actions of the Prophet ﷺ and so on and so forth. So then you start to get a vibe of why they emphasize this or emphasize that. It's very fascinating if you are into that kind of thing. Okay, so we did from point, if you want to open up the Tahawiyya, I had given you guys a link from Abu Amina's website, if I'm not mistaken. There's several online. I don't necessarily know which is the best English translation, and I will, inshallah, this week I'll look up. I know there's the one Ibn Abil Izz al-Hanafi. That's a classic translation. It's like very long. I know that has been translated. I have not actually looked at it in English. So I'll look at the ones online, inshallah, and I'll try to find, maybe there's a concise one, maybe there's one I can share with you. The commentary, that is. Because the text of the Tahawiyya, I had already shared it. The text of Tahawiyya is pretty short, as I said. If you want some more commentary, then I'll share some with you. So we had done points 1 to 6, right? We had covered points 1 to 6, which are pretty straightforward. Let me find it here. Yes. There is nothing like him. There's nothing that can weaken him. There's nothing worthy of worship but him. He is the eternal without a beginning, and he is enduring without an end. He will never perish, nor will he come to an end. And nothing happens except what he wills, right? So we stopped at nothing happens except what he wills, and we said we'll continue from today. All right. You guys see what I'm saying? You found it? So the one that I have in front of me is numbered, but if yours is not numbered, then just you can put a number on it. This is number 7. Nothing happens except what he wills. Okay. وَلَا يَكُونُ إِلَّا مَا يُرِيدُ. So when you say nothing happens in this world except what God wills, does that mean everything? A leaf falls off of a tree. Did God will that? Yes? You are here today on a Tuesday. Does God will that? A person steals. Does God will that? Yes or no? A person murders another person. Did God will that? Yes? Who says no? Okay. So I'm glad we have a discussion going now. All you need is one guy to refuse and we have a discussion. So, all right. So how do we understand that? Good and bad happens in this world. Al-khayru fi yadayk wal-sharru laysa ilayk. The Prophet ﷺ said about Allah. So good and bad happens as we perceive it in this world. How do we understand that? Does God want someone to be murdered? Mhm. Jazakum khair. That's our first premise. Let's write this one down. Is that our perception is limited. Our perception in this world is limited. So many things happen in your life that at first you assumed something of it. You assumed, well, this could only be bad for me. And then it turned out better for you, right? والله يعلم وأنتم لا تعلمون وعسى أن تكرهوا شيئا وهو خير لكم وعسى أن تحبوا شيئا وهو شر لكم. Right? Allah says perhaps that you like something and it's better for you and it's worse for you. And perhaps you hate something but it actually was better for you. And Allah knows and you know not. Right? So Allah says be careful about your limited perceptions. So that's one way to, one premise through which, or one lens through which we perceive good and bad. But still, murder is murder. Right? Some innocent person was murdered. Now what? How do we understand that? How else? Did God want that to happen? I heard no. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Jazakallah khair. That's exactly. Oh, there's al He said, هذا ربي هذا أكبر. You know, one of the names of Allah is Al-Kabir, right? The greatest, the biggest. Or Al-Akbar, Allahu Akbar, right? Allah is greater, Allah is greater. Whatever you can throw at me, God is greater. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, his people were pagans. So he was, and some of them were, they worshipped the constellations and different planets and so on. So he said to them, first he pointed at the moon and different constellations and said, well, okay, I'll take this as a god. You know, you guys are angry at me because I don't worship idols and different things. I'll worship this. He was sort of like teaching them through this manner, demonstratively. So when he's like, فَلَمَّا أَفَلَ قَالَ لَا أُحِبُّ الْآفِلِينَ. When it was daytime and the moon's gone, he's like, well, how can I worship something that's only here half the time? So then he said, different planets and different, like and the sun and so on. He said, هَذَا رَبِّي هَذَا أَكْبَرُ. He said, this is my Lord. I'll take this as Lord because this is bigger. Why would I be worshiping something smaller? It makes no sense. Bigger, by that kind of magnitude, is definitely greater and stronger, right? So basically, basic logic. But he's like, the concept of if anybody can bet, then God ceases to be, even if it's in one attribute. So if anything is stronger than God, then yeah, sorry, I'll follow the stronger one, because that stronger one can defeat you. If anyone has more knowledge than God, then knowledge is power, right? That thing is more powerful than God. If anybody can do something that they sneak away, they get away with it without God's knowledge. So they're not necessarily more knowledgeable than God in all things. They just happened to find a loophole where if you do this, God can't see. You get it? Then God ceases to be God. Does that make sense? Because there's a loophole, there's a blind spot. And if God has a blind spot, then all we need to do is take advantage of the blind spot. Given enough time, there will be enough taking advantage of the blind spot that God will be bested. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. May Allah protect us from these thoughts. These are all philosophical arguments, but the concept being is that the root of it is that by virtue of being God, God is all-powerful. By virtue of being God, God is in control of everything. He doesn't lose control. And by virtue of being God, God is all-knowing. Nothing happens without His understanding or without His prior knowledge. So this takes us back to, so the three premises are, number one, our perception is limited. Number two, our existence in this world is a test. Number three, nothing happens within the test without that's not in God's control. So once you've reached your logical, you've returned to your logical starting points, your logical conclusion is that therefore anything that happens within the realm of the test, well, yes, it was within God's control. Which leads us to the understanding, the traditional way that the scholars of Islam have sort of divided it for us to grasp. And in fiqh, we love to categorize, and this is not fiqh, this is aqeedah, but it's the same concept. When you categorize things, it's sort of you compartmentalize them, you sort of separate them, it becomes easier to understand. They refer to two kinds of irada, two kinds of God's want, or what God allows, or wills rather. Will is probably a better word. Irada al-kawniyya, which I think the best translation I found for it is permission. What God permits. Right? And then al-irada al-shar'iyya is God's will. Although they both are irada, which is will. But this is just a term. Kawniyya, meaning in al-kawn, in the creation, in the realm of existence. Shar'iyya comes from the word sharia, or commands. So God's commands versus God's will, love, commands. You'll find these translations if you read these Islamic Aqeedah books. Permission. There may be some others here. Let me see. Qadar, yes, they say permission or destiny. Destiny. What God has destined. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So yeah. So how do you separate what God has permitted to exist versus what God commands from you? So what God has permitted to exist, it can be good. He allowed trees to exist. He allowed love to exist. Or it could be the absence of good, which is evil, referred to as evil, which is murder and the things that we talked about. And then anything in between. It's a spectrum. Literally everything in this dunya, God has allowed it and permitted it to exist within the realm of the test. Yes? In Arabic, al-irada al-shar'iyya. Making sure I spelled it right. Yeah, it's right. Al-irada al-shar'iyya, which is God's commands and God's will in reference to His commands. So the first one is His permission, what He has allowed to exist. So it's a spectrum from good to evil or absence of good. Let's say here, Good is here. And here is evil. And literally anything in between. And then here, God's will and command, when God wills or commands something, where does it fit on the spectrum? Or does it have the same spectrum? If it's something God commanded, like prayer, it can only ever be good. Right? It can only ever be good. God can permit things to exist within His realm for the purpose of the test. He can allow things to exist that are, because again, we said, by virtue of it being a test, you have to have the option to do wrong, to say no. So He can allow that for a temporary time. Dunya is temporary. And then the afterlife, it's rebalanced. Allah forces or allows things to get rebalanced. Everybody who owes a debt, whether it's money, whether it's physical harm, any type of debt, is going to get repaid. You might find an atheist or someone who agnostic who believes in a creator or believes in something out there. They refer to it as the rebalancing of the universe. They don't believe in an afterlife. They don't believe in accountability the same way that we believe in it. But they believe that it has to happen in some way or the other. There has to be a rebalancing because the universe can't be unbalanced for long. We believe the same thing, but we believe it's going to be an event, An-Naba' al-Azim, the great major event, which is Yawm al-Qiyam. So God is allowing a temporary unbalancing, and then He will allow everything to command everything to be rebalanced on the Day of Judgment. If God commands something, it can only ever be good. So this is Allah's commands. So salah, being kind to your parents, being kind to your neighbors, what God wills. So whenever someone says, "Oh, you did, inshallah, Allah is pleased with you," that all fits here. It doesn't fit here. This is just what God permitted to exist, right? So if you say, "How can that exist? How can murder exist? How can so on?" There's it's all within. Allah has allowed a temporary, if you want to phrase it this way, Allah has allowed a temporary unbalancing for the purpose of the test, but He has promised and He will guarantee that things will be rebalanced on the Day of Judgment, and things will be properly put back into the place that they belong. As for God's actual will, what He commands, it can only ever be good. So we can deduce from that when we were asking last week, what is the proper thing to do in this case? I think someone had asked about gender interactions or like separating between brothers and sisters, that kind of thing, where sometimes our question is, what's the proper Islamic answer for this? Or what did Sheikh so-and-so say? Ultimately, our question is, what does Allah want from us in this regard? But in another wording of that question is, you can say, what is the good thing to do here? Because what Allah wants from us is the ultimate good thing. It's the best thing, in fact. Does that make sense? If you're saying, should I be awake at Fajr time praying or should I not? You'll have a million different excuses, a million different reasonings and so on. Ultimately, no, you should be. It is a good thing, intrinsically good thing, and thereby Allah commanded it. So it's a loop. It's a good thing because God commanded it, but because God commanded it, He allowed good things to sprout from it. So you're going to find external good benefits, health-wise and other corroborating evidence, if you want to call that. Things that help you, like Ibrahim alayhi salam said, وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي, so my heart can find rest. We find certain health benefits in fasting. We find in prayer and certain, we all benefit from being kind to one another and so on. So it's good. It's intrinsically good because God commanded it, but He also allows it to sprout good in other directions as well. Yes?
I was going to say, from a purely philosophical perspective,
yes.
Why is it that one can say that anything that God does is good? Like one can totally say, well, maybe God does want that, right?
Yes.
So from an Islamic perspective, obviously it's clear because we know Allah Ta'ala, and He describes what He is to us, so we know it from what He describes, right?
Yeah.
From a total philosophical perspective, someone's like irreligious, right?
Yes.
You say, right? Well, anything God commands can be good. Where does that logical kind of come from?
Well, it's great. So, are you guys getting the question? Like we take it as a given as Muslims that God is good, and everything therefore that God does is good, and we cannot accept wal khayru laysa wa sharru laysa ilayk. The Prophet ﷺ said, "I will not attribute evil to you, O God." Al khayru fi yadayk. The Prophet ﷺ used to say, "Oh Allah, all good is rooted from you, and it's in your hands, and I will not ascribe evil to you." So we take that as a given. But from purely philosophical perspective, if someone were to challenge and say, logically speaking, I can accept that God can do evil. We as Muslims are responsible. Well, first off, it's from a logical premise. We don't necessarily negate the possibility. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Inni haramtu dhulma ala nafsi, waja'altuhu baynakum muharrama." Allah says, "I have made dhulm haram on myself, and I made it haram on you as well." So that means God can do dhulm. وَلَا يُسْأَلُ عَمَّا يَفْعَلْ. Nobody could possibly ask him, why did you do, nobody could challenge him. And in this case, al-mas'ul, when you're responsible, it's implying that the person asking you has some sort of power over you. Because that's why I can, hey, why do you do that? If somebody has way less power than you asks you why do you do that, you'd be like, get out of here. But it's an implication that they have some sort of command or power, or they're holding you accountable. So in reality, just out of philosophically, we do believe God is all powerful, that he can do as he wills, and no one can hold him to account, philosophically speaking. However, Allah, by virtue of being God, as far as we're concerned, it's not maybe not necessarily a logical premise, although you can make the argument where doing evil or doing dhulm is a flaw, and by virtue of being God, by virtue of being worthy of worship, the only reason God is worthy of worship is that he's free from flaws. If he has any flaw whatsoever, even if somebody found a loophole that they can hide behind and God won't see it, then that's enough of a flaw that he's not worthy of worship in my eyes. So that you could say that from a logical, but they would still philosophy is like a never-ending sort of, well, technically you can make this argument, technically that. So you gotta, what we had, I think we talked about this a few weeks ago, is that you have to have a sort of assess, especially if you're doing da'wah, but only even for yourself, you have to assess what would satisfy this question, because some questions literally, by definition, don't have an answer. We're actually going to get to one later today. Actually, we're going to cover it again maybe in a few weeks. Some questions don't even have an answer. Like, for example, why 3 rak'at instead of 4 for Maghrib? Why not 5? Why not 6? That question literally has no answer. It just you can just keep asking why and never-ending regress. So yeah, logically, perceptually, it can be perceived, but we, as within our definition of God being free from all flaws, then it doesn't fit in our premise, and we could not accept a God like that. He would not be worthy of worship, and therefore he loses his he's just a powerful being who happens to have power over you, as opposed to La ilaha illallah, the only God worthy of worship. What makes him worthy of worship? He's free from flaw. He does not commit dhulm. He encompasses all good attributes. Right? If you want to write this down, actually, this is something that. What does it mean as a Muslim to believe in Allah? It's 3 main things the scholars have traditionally said. The first one is, what does it mean that you believe in Allah as a Muslim? Number 1, I believe that He is the only one worthy of worship. In this life, I'm going to worship something or someone. Some people choose a concept. Some people choose a creation. Some people choose several. Right? Shurakat. They choose different pagan, they divide their worship. As a Muslim, your first belief is the only thing or person or anything worthy of worship is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by virtue of being worthy of what makes something worthy of worship is the next 2 things, which is number 1. Number 2, that He alone is the Rabb of everything. The Rabb means 2 things. He owns everything, and He maintains everything. He owns everything, nothing is out of His control, and nothing is out of His maintenance. And number 3, that He possesses all the best names and attributes. And these 2 things, the next 2 make Him worthy of worship. The next 2 make the first one true. Why is God worthy of worship? Because He owns everything, He controls everything, and He has all the best names and attributes. He has given us a glimpse of His being, which is that any good that we can perceive, huwa ahaqqu bih. He has more right to that good. Any good that you can perceive, then God has a more right for it to exist within Him. Mercy, knowledge, power, strength, forgiveness, etc., etc. Does that make sense? And I'm sure, if you're really into philosophy, although most people just never ending, it gets boring. But yeah, you see a lot of arguments, and ultimately you just have to come to terms with, well, is the argument satisfying logically and intellectually? And then if that's good enough for you, then I think you have to give yourself a stopping point. Otherwise, literally everything and anything can be argued. All right. So let's see here. I want to continue. I want to actually try to move past this point. I had a question here. You know what? Let's see. Okay, I'll ask this question because at least it'll let you guys get into a group. Okay, so we said, how can bad exist, right? Or our next question is, why even have a testing phase to begin with? So we said within the realm of the testing phase, good and bad can happen, but then it will be rebalanced at the end. Why even have a testing phase? So ultimately, this is one of the most age-old philosophical questions before Islam as we know it existed, when the previous divine faiths existed and so on. So this is, I'll be frank with you guys, in terms of, this actually goes right back to your question. In terms of philosophy, if you really get into that field, It's never ending. There's a lot of arguments that are not, you have not like fully, like math. You have not fully given a satisfactory mathematical answer. 1 + 1 = 2, and that's that. Philosophy is just never ending questioning and picking apart and so on and so forth. So what you have to equip yourself and prepare yourself mentally to do is, I'm not going to get an answer typically as satisfying as 1 + 1 = 2. However, I will get intellectually satisfying viewpoints and mindsets and approaches. And that you will have to decide which way. Literally, there's madahib, there's approaches. You have to decide which of the paths you're going to choose in the philosophical argument. So why even have a testing phase to begin with? I'm not going to delve on this one too deeply because we're going to cover it in the future in terms of why God does things. But before that, in order to help us perceive that, I'm going to get you guys into groups, speak to the nearest 3 or 4 people next to you. We'll do it for the next few minutes, inshallah. So here's a question that you got to answer with your group. What motivates human action? List me the things that motivate human action. And here's a hint to make it easier, hopefully. The shorter your list, the better. Don't give me a list of 20 things like specifics. The more, I want categories. So the shorter your list, the better. What motivates human action? When you do something in the morning, when you do something in the evening, when you do something now, when people do something on large scale, small scale, what's the motivators how many can you list, all right? And the shorter the list, the better. Let's get into groups of 3 or 4, and we'll talk in a few minutes, inshallah. Yeah.
If someone's praying something, right, and I go join them, I doesn't realize. I don't know my perspective. To me, I don't know if it's sunnah or so I join the right?
Yeah.
And obviously, I continue whatever I need to continue. Is that sufficient for my salah, right? Or do I need some actually? And they told me after I was praying sunnah, right? Now is your time.
So you said he didn't realize?
I did this. He's already praying sunnah. I walk in, right? I just do it.
So did he accept to be your imam?
He just kind of went up and down, didn't say anything.
He didn't raise his, he didn't make his voice
I just kind of
loud.
followed along.
So there's 2 methods about it, 2 approaches in general, which is that no, you cannot join somebody else when he's praying sunnah with the niyyah of a different salah, or any salah with a niyyah of a different salah. So the concern here is that a lot of our brothers and sisters from the Asian subcontinent, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they're taught if somebody joins you like in sunnah, like don't accept it.
He was
Yeah.
I think he was Pakistani. Yeah.
So in that case, no, your salah is not valid. You're following an imam who does not approve of you following him. Usually they just ignore you. He's allowed to sort of do one of these. Yeah, his salah is not invalidated to announce to you, like, give me a minute, or sorry, but so just giving you a movement and just it's up to you. So yeah, it's unfortunate because in the Arab world primarily we follow the madhab that no, just join any salah. They're both valid interpretations of fiqh. There's no direct hadith that invalidates either direction, so it's all a fiqhi approach, like a qawaid approach. So ultimately, I do it, but if I see, based on my experiences, because I'm like awkwardly, what do I do now? Do I wait for him to make ruku'? If I see somebody of that background who I don't know well, and I don't know, like if he's part of our masjid, he accepts it, I'll join him. Otherwise, I khalas. You probably should, yes, because you were following the imam that you weren't didn't approve. Because yeah, he finished his two and you added on, right? Ah, interesting. Yes. Just ihtiyatan, but because I'd have to research. I know Imam Nawawi himself. He was a faqih in Shafi'i fiqh. He had said very clearly. He said, but this is a different story. So they're talking about in their era where there was political leadership that were very evil people. So he said to keep the peace, where we can follow them in jama'ah, but not actually be praying behind them. Like you have your own, but you're following his movements. So I'm trying to do qiyas or sort of say, like, is that the same case? I'd have to do some deep research. See, well, yeah, I can tell.
You said there was three things, but this is not right. But can you say those again?
Yes. God is the only one. Allah is the only one worthy of worship. That's number one. You could use here. You can write on this. And number three, Allah is the only Rabb. Rabb meaning the owner and maintainer of everything. Owner, maintainer, sustainer.
You said
Owner, maintainer, and sustainer. Yeah. All right, brothers and sisters. Jazakumullah khairan. What do we get? What's your list? Anybody have a list that is more than 5 things? If your list is more than 5 things, raise your hand. That's good, mashallah. You guys stick. Yeah? Is it? More than 5. Oh, I told you the hint is less is more. But yeah, give me one of your things.
Human direct incentives, so some incentives is happiness for them.
Happiness, great. So what motivates human action? So what are the incentives behind our actions? Happiness. Let's hear some more. Keep saying them until you've heard all of yours, right? If people talk and you haven't heard yours, keep adding. Happiness, desire for reward, success, satisfaction, fear, consciousness. Interesting. So how's that? How does that motivate action? Okay, awareness, I guess. Consciousness. I thought you meant like by virtue of existing. I think, therefore I am. Or I am, therefore I'm motivated. Which is interesting because that you can argue that too. Philosophy is one of those things you can be like, well, technically by virtue of existing, you have to have some sort of drive. But yeah, I'm glad it's not in that direction. So awareness that reward exists. So far, success, reward, happiness, fear. Thoughts create feelings and feelings create action. Great. So feelings would be the motivation, emotion in this case. And thoughts, well, thoughts are, the initiator, correct? Yes. Dunya or akhirah, so that could be your drive, right? To better your dunya, to better your akhirah, right? That's future, happiness. What else we got? Physical or material benefit. Great. Salah is a motivator. How so? Who's talking? Oh, sorry. The masks, I can't really tell. Yeah. So,
I don't know, but I always feel like this because this like yesterday morning I missed Fajr. I woke up like late, and I didn't have to.
okay, inshallah. So that's may Allah bless you and allow you to catch Fajr, inshallah, every day, and all of us. Ameen. So, if you fear that if you miss Fajr, then you're gonna have a bad day. So your fear of having a bad day motivates you to pray Fajr. So fear of having a bad day. What else? I see a hand in the back. Yes, sister. To achieve goals. Yes. Love. Sister? Ideology. Can you elaborate?
So essentially, what your worldview is, it motivates your decisions.
What you believe in.
Yeah, so I group, for instance, politics, religion, those are all ideologies. So let's say you're a socialist, that transforms your worldview. Or let's say you're like terrorist group, that also informs your worldview as well. Basically, like your mindset.
Your mindset. Great. So your belief system. So somebody will be motivated by what they believe in. Great. Yes. Approval from who? From others or God or yourself. Basically just approval in general. Approval would be a positive or a negative thing? Positive. So everybody who's given me an example now, if you had to place it on positive or negative, where would you place yours? So you said fear. Negative. I saw hope, happiness, success, reward, benefit, positive, right? Overwhelmingly. So the scholars of Islam have shortened this list to two things from an Islamic philosophy perspective. There's only two things on this list and two things only. جلب منفعة أو دفع ضرر. Are we okay? Are they finally here? دفع ضرر. So to procure a benefit or to ward off evil or to what is it? To procure benefit or to ward off harm. To avoid harm is easier. What do you guys think? To procure benefit, to achieve benefit, to get some sort of benefit, or to avoid harm? What do you think? Yes. Did it cover every single thing we said here? Even the ideology one, which was, that's why I asked you guys to elaborate, because that could have been tricky. But our brother in the front, what's your name? Abdullah. So you had said consciousness, awareness. I kept asking you to elaborate till it was awareness that I could get reward and there could be good. So then that's the number one. And our sisters mentioned the mindset, the ideology, belief. It's always rooted in a risk-reward system. Pros and cons. Nobody does something just to do it. Even if it's the feeling good about having served your ideology, feeling good about having served your community, etc. That's still to procure benefit. You're trying that good feeling, that seeing the fruits of your labor. That's good that you're seeking to achieve. So the motivations of a human being, literally every single thing you can think of, is a form of this. Even paradoxically, if you're harming yourself, drugs, may Allah protect us. There, you could be objectively telling someone, like they put those labels on the smoke on the smoking on the cigarette packs. They show a person like this causes cancer. You're going to harm yourself, but there's still benefit they're getting from it. That's why they bought the cigarettes. Yes. They otherwise they would not be buying something to harm themselves with absolutely no benefit to themselves. Even if the benefit is short term and the harm is long term, or the benefit is small but the harm is greater, it doesn't matter. The point is there's a perception that I'm perceiving either I'm getting something benefit or I'm protecting myself from some sort of harm. That is what drives our action and motivates our action, correct? Agreed? Does anybody have any challenge to this? Yes.
I have a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
So, is this being interpreted from an individual standpoint?
Even on societal level. On some level, actions are initiated, even when you see a cultural practice that has been gone on for generations, and now you're like, I don't even perceive why people still do this. At some point, usually when you dig, it was initiated at some point for some perceived benefit or protection from some harm.
So, to give an example,
Yeah.
if there is a political decision and that either preferring more power or wealth, then in this realm, what would that fall under? So would that be under benefit?
It could be both. I mean, so if the politician is looking out for their own interests, self-interest at the expense of the people they're supposed to be helping and representing, then they're looking for benefit for their own self, and they don't care whose harm they're causing. You know, that's, at the end of the day, it's still using this formula. Their actions still fall under this, right? So they don't care. They're only seeking to help themselves at the expense of others because it means more help for themselves. It wouldn't make sense that they're like, oh, I'm going to shoot my own nation in the foot and myself as well. For what? For what perceived benefit? Why would they possibly do that, right? So,
This should be understood through many scales and many layers. So
yeah.
as in someone's individual equation or on a societal level.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, literally any decision that a human being makes, when you wake up in the morning, when you choose to wake up, you hit the alarm clock, it's cold outside, you don't want to be up for school, you still do it, right? Why? Some benefit that you're going to get. You got to go to school, you got to go to work, you got to get some money, you got to look out for your future. You'd rather not instinctually or, you know, whatever, emotionally or biologically, you want another 2 hours of sleep, but you won't do it. And let's say you sleep in and you miss school that day. You still did it for perceived benefit to enjoy another 2 hours of sleep. Literally everything we do, every single thing. Why are you here today on a Tuesday night? May Allah accept and reward you, inshallah. It's probably both, right? To learn about your deen, some benefit, to avoid the harms of falling into sin or being lack of knowledge, lack of ilm, and so on. Literally every single thing that a creation, that a human being can possibly do or get motivated to do is going to fall into these categories. So beautifully simplified. I'll go a step further, not just the humans, animals. Animals act on the same thing, right? They perceive a benefit or perceive a harm. Even when animals are much more instinctual. So they might not even understand what they're doing something for. But it's ingrained in their biology to act in a way that is helping. Squirrels I don't know if they understand or not why they bury acorns left and right? But then they come and they need they need it for the times when, you know, the winter or so on and so forth. And then they are helping the trees you know, they inadvertently grow trees left and right? When they're burying their acorns, because they forget most of them. So even though animals act instinctually for the most part, it's still the same concept. This is what drives their action. Even microorganisms, bacteria and so on. Even trees that don't necessarily have a intellect, right? A tree, if the sun is coming from a certain angle, the tree grows in that direction, right? Right? And it'll just the root will end up, or the trunk will end up being angled, right? Same thing, and so on and so forth. The trees that are in the winter areas, they have a thick coating on their leaves so they don't lose moisture during the cold times, and so on and so forth, or in the hot areas, right? So this applies to not just humans, every living thing, every living creation, and in fact, non-living creations as well. Even though they have no irada, they have no understanding, no free will, they don't do anything, but things will move. They move in the direction of their best interest, whether it's intended or not intended, right? In general, for self-preservation and so on. So this is a qaida, this is a premise that every single creation, because by definition we are dependent. And stay with me for a minute, we're wrapping up here, I promise. So by definition, this is what motivates the root of our actions. Now, when you ask, why did God create life on earth? Why in this version, a test? Why not just speed us up to Jannah and just live eternal goodness? Why not this? Why that? Why a test? Why especially in this format? Why life and death? Why night and day? Why breathing? Why? A lot of these questions, we're going to come up to a lot of whys later on, and I'm going to, because we've covered it now, I might just power through it in the future, inshallah. But the idea is, our brains perceive through any of these actions. When you ask yourself, why did that tree grow that way? You say, oh, I guess because the sunlight was coming here. Why do those, why do certain animals shed their fur during the summer? Oh, it's because it's hotter and they don't need that much fur. And then the fur grows again by the winter because it's colder. Your brain, well, that's going to help them avoid harm and get some benefit. Everything you're trying to perceive it through this lens. That's how you perceive motivation. So when you ask yourself, why does God do X or Y or Z? You have to understand, your first premise is that, well, I can't run it through this lens, right? Because God can never be harmed, and God does not receive any benefit whatsoever. So your first premise, and that's how you keep in the back of your mind. As I'm trying to traverse why God does stuff, I told you there's some viewpoints that you've heard from Muslim philosophers, even Christian philosophers before us, that you're like, wow, this resonates with me. I can see and sort of accept it on some intellectual level. But unless you root it back to this concept that, well, God, I have to understand that God's not going to fit into my rubric. So keeping that in mind, I'm gonna read about why God does things, and hopefully something will resonate. So Allah says in the Quran, لا يسأل عما يفعل وهم يسألون. And in fact, number 8, the next one of At-Tahawi, who can read for me the next line in the Tahawi treatise? We said there's nothing worthy of worship. Nothing happens except what He wills. What's the next one? Who can read it out loud? So I'm going to share with you guys next week. I'm going to write it here before I forget. I'm going to share with you guys a numbered one, so we can just go straight to the number. They're all the same, but this is just so, just be easier to reference. There's nothing worthy of worship except Him. He will never perish. Nothing happens except what He wills. That was number 7, right? Next one, number 8. No imagination can fully conceive of Him. No understanding can fully comprehend Him. No imagination can fully encompass Him and conceive of Him, and no understanding can fully comprehend Him. Notice we're talking about fully comprehend. You can comprehend some things about God. He's merciful, etc. Otherwise, how can you even perceive anything? But fully conceptualizing God and fully understanding His motivations, if you can even refer to them as that, is by definition, again, not in the being of God. And then number 9, He does not resemble any created being. Oh, I see that his numbering system here is off of 1, but I'll send you a text next week, and then that way we'll just be on the same number. He does not resemble any created being. And then we'll continue from here next week, inshallah ta'ala. We're actually going to start with this point, and I'm just going to give a brief, maybe 2 minutes extra about this point just to solidify it, and then we'll continue, inshallah, with the next 5 or 6 points next week, inshallah. There's going to be some weeks where we're just rapid fire. We're just going through 5, 6, 7 of the points, because it's just like things that we already know and we're just going through. Other weeks we'll spend a decent amount of time on 2 or 3. Any questions? Any comments? All right. Jazakumullah khairan, everybody. We'll end right here on point number 8. He does not resemble any created being, or point number 9 rather. And inshallah, next week or during the week, I'm going to give you a numbered system of Tahawi, and I'm going to look for a commentary. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Jazakumullah khairan, everybody. I hope you have a good week, inshallah, and I will see you next Tuesday.